I'd like to now begin a very interesting presentation from OneBlood. As you all know, OneBlood is our blood center for the entire state as well as several other states. And we have three distinguished people going to discuss the subject of convalescent plasma. First is Dr. Richard Gammon. He is their medical director. He's board certified in clinical pathology as well as blood banking and transfusion medicine, and is on the faculty of several of our medical universities, including University of Central Florida, University of South Florida, and Nova. Dr. Rita Wright is their chief medical officer and is also certified in anatomic pathology, clinical pathology, blood banking, and transfusion medicine, and is a graduate of University of Miami, and is a national authority on blood banking and transfusion medicine and multiple transfusion medicine organizations. Thank you for coming and bringing us this new information.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting us to talk with you. This is an extremely important meeting to us because you represent the physicians of the state of Florida. And of course, it's no secret we're heading into a pretty significant crisis. And as you all are well aware, last week, FDA approved the use of convalescent plasma from COVID-19 recovered persons for treatment of disease. It has shown some very promising results, actually, in the studies out of China, some of which are not yet published. We do have a consultant working with us who is one of the authors on the Chinese studies, and she has sort of insider information. So and there have been good anecdotal information in the United States on the few units that have been transfused to patients. You may have become aware that the mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez, was the first convalescent COVID person to donate plasma for a person he did not know whose family pleaded for a donor, and he became aware of it, and he knew that he was eligible, so he donated. And this is anecdotal, of course, but much to our very pleasant surprise, the donor had a steady downhill course on the ventilator at age 71 in the hospital, showed significant improvement within 24 hours of receiving that product, and they were able to lower the ventilator setting. So this was very consistent with what our consultant from China said they had seen in their study of 100 of these types of patients. So we think we have something here that can help turn the tide or flatten the curve or whatever it's going to take to get ahead of this. Our problem, and this is what I'd like to focus my introductory remarks on, is that we have no inventory of this product. It's manufactured one by one from donors. And so we have a very somewhat burdensome front end to getting the donors through the door, because the FDA has put some guard bands around the screening requirements for these donors. So they have to be eligible as blood donors, and that's simple. We do eligible blood donors and collect plasma on them all the time. So that part of the process is a piece of cake for us. The problem is that the donors have to meet certain criteria based on how far out they are from their last symptom. They have to have a series of tests based on where they are out from their last symptom. There are considerations about female donors who've ever been pregnant in HLA. So there's a series of tests that have to be taken care of. And this is where we turn to our physician partners in the hospitals in our community to help us, because we have no database of COVID positive people. But many of you do know who they are and can reach out to them, or family members that have survived COVID and now have a family member in the hospital, et cetera, to see if they might be interested in donating. It's a new process. It's been manual so far. This weekend we brought up an automated front end for the actual donor that's interested in getting into the system. We hope to have the front end for the physicians who have perhaps a patient that they would like to treat, and also a donor for that patient or another patient that they would like to put in the system. So we're in a transition period, and I'm going to apologize ahead of time for that, because as you can imagine, it's been a very crazy week. We have a lot of pent-up demand for this product, a lot of very emotionally engaged people that are trying to get it to their critically loved one or friend as quickly as possible. And we don't have anything on the shelf that we can hand off to them. So it's very challenging. It will smooth out, hopefully, unless, of course, we get, the system gets incredibly overwhelmed. And as Dr. Bush pointed out, we have some pretty grim predictions of numbers of cases coming at us in the next 2 weeks, which hopefully will not pan out. But if it does, it may not really smooth out too much. So I just wanted to reach out to you to gain your understanding and support as we move through this, and to really make it clear that, it isn't something we have control over, that the front end of it, the identification of the donor and the qualification of the donor has to meet FDA regulations for this experimental product. And we entirely are relying on the clinicians to do those tests and use, FDA approved testing and do them within the proper timeframes for us to qualify that donor. So having said that, again, I want to thank you. This is a very historic moment, I think, for all of us. We're going to learn a lot. And I'd like to turn it over now to Dr. Gammon, who has the scientific piece of this to present.
Thank you, Dr. Reich. So we're going to break this into 3 parts. We're going to talk a little bit about the results of a study that was published in JAMA last week. And Dr. Reich is correct. There were a few other papers out there that weren't peer-reviewed, and I didn't feel comfortable sharing with the group. Hopefully there'll be more out there. Then we'll talk about the OneBlood process, and then I've got kind of a frequently asked questions section, and then we'll wrap it up and open it to the discussions. And we've got Martin Grable here from our administrative end that'll be available to answer questions as well. So the paper out of JAMA, I summarize it here in the next several slides. This was done at Shenzhen Hospital in China. The patients had to be diagnosed with quantitative reverse transcriptase PCR to be eligible to receive, and the CCP is the COVID-19 convalescent plasma, if they met the following criteria that you see on the screen. The patients had neutralizing antibody titers that were tested 1 day before receiving the convalescent plasma. The ABO blood types of the patients were identified to ensure compatibility. And these patients received antiviral agents until the COVID-19 viral loads became negative. And that means they received it during their entire course of hospital stay, those that received the plasma and those that didn't. And that's one, we'll talk about the limitations in a moment of this study. The donors were five donors, ages 18 to 60, and you can see the characteristics of the donors on the slide here. Let me turn on the laser pointer. Over here, the plasma was collected by apheresis. These individuals had been recovered from COVID-19 infection and tested negative. They were asymptomatic for 10 days. That's a little different than the criteria we're going to talk about in a moment for the U.S. The serum COVID-19 ELISA antibody titer had to be higher than 1 in 1,000. And if you look over here on the screen, you can see that the antibody titers were definitely higher than that, and the neutralizing antibody titer greater than 40. And again, all the donors had titers at least double that. Other patients, 5 patients, you can see the age ranges over here, and they're shown on this table from the JAMA article. They're all treated between 10 and 22 days after admission. One of the things I wanted to just kind of show you, because there's a lot on this screen here, but the complications, most of them, I guess all of them had ARDS, and all of them were classified as critical for disease classification. So this was, again, used selectively, at least in these patients, for those that were the most sickest. These patients received 2 treatments of 200 milliliters of plasma, and the unit was transfused the same day as the donation. And again, there'll be some differences between what we can do in the U.S. and what was done in China, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The results, so for the 5 patients, the body temperature is normalized within 3 days. You can see that very nicely on this graph here. One of them did not. A sequential organ failure assessment that they were using decreased in the patients. The data is not shown on the screen. You can see the PaO2 and the FiO2 increased within 12 days, and the viral load decreased and became negative within 12 days in several of the patients. And when they consider the normal range 0 to 7, you can see patient 1 and patient 4 met that criteria. Talking about their antibody titers here, the specific ELISA and neutralizing antibody titers increased after the transfusion of the plasma. You can see it on these 3 charts. ARDS resolved in 4 patients after 12 days. 3 patients were weaned from mechanical ventilation within 2 weeks. 3 were discharged within 2 months, and 2 were in stable condition at the end of the study period. So there are some significant limitations to this study, as you no doubt know. Small numbers, 5 is not necessarily a large amount, and there were no controls. It's unclear if the patients would have improved with or without the convalescent plasma. All patients were treated with multiple other agents during their entire course of stay until the viral load became negative. That includes antivirals and steroids. Also, mentioned that the convalescent plasma was given between 10 and 22 days after admission. So the authors raised the question, what if we gave this at a different time? Would that have had different outcomes on the patient? And also whether this approach reduced case fatality rates is also unknown. So the authors concluded that the study highlighted the possibility that antibodies from convalescent plasma may have contributed to clearance of the virus and improvement of symptoms. All right, so let's change gears and talk a little bit about what's going on right now in the U.S. and more specifically with OneBlood. So as far as patients go, the FDA does approve use of the infusion of COVID-19 convalescent plasma on an individual patient basis with an emergency IND. And I'll show you, we have some links available to that. That can be done either through a written request that can be approved in a few hours, or an emergency phone call if the patient is very sick, and that can be done, a verbal can be given over the phone, followed by written approval. You know, it's really up to the hospitals and physicians to define the patients to treat. I showed you some criteria in that study, but that's by no means standardized. And the dosage isn't standardized. You know, a non-peer reviewed journal I looked at just gave 1 dose of plasma. So we don't know at this point if 1, 2, or even more would be an appropriate dosage. While the literature shows the transfusion happened on the day of collection, the FDA has gave us clear guidelines. Dr. Reich has been in communication with Dr. Peter Marks, who's the head of Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER, that oversees the blood banks in the U.S. And he was clear that he wants the infectious disease testing done on these units before they go out to the individual patients. So even though we're working closely with our testing facility, Creative Testing Solutions, to get this turned around pretty quickly, it may not be the same day that we send out the plasma product. This is just pathways to treat patients. You know, the clinical trials and the expanded access are there for individuals that are doing research. For this group, most likely you're going to be using single patient emergency IND that we just talked about on the last slide. This is a physician letter, and this material was, you should have a copy of this right out to the group, and there is a link on the PDF file to view the FDA guidance, and there is some information for you to call. It's basically a COVID hotline if you've got a patient that meets your needs. And as Dr. Reich mentioned, we are up, this is a work in progress. We hope to have a site up for the physicians sometime this week. What do we need from the physicians? We need documentation of SARS-CoV infection and the donors that we're bringing in, we need documentation that these individuals actually have had a laboratory test with a diagnosis. So if a doctor tells them, look, those symptoms, may be consistent with COVID, self-quarantine for 14 days. If they don't have a test, they're not going to be able to qualify as a donor. Also, if they present 14 to 27 days after becoming symptom-free, then OneBlood's going to need negative results for COVID-19, either from one or more nasopharyngeal swab specimens or by a molecular diagnostic test from blood. If the donors present symptom-free 28 days or longer, then they're eligible, and per the FDA, we do not need additional documentation of a prior, we require diagnosis of the initial COVID test, but we do not need a confirmatory negative test to confirm recovery. So just to kind of walk through that briefly again, we're generally not going to accept individuals that are less than 14 days out. 14 to 27 days, we'll need the initial test and an additional test to show that they now are free of the COVID-19. If they come 28 days or more out after they've been symptom-free, then all we need is the initial test. No additional testing needs to be done. As far as the donors go, Dr. Reich alluded to this in her discussion. OneBlood will take the lead. If it's a female who's been has a history of pregnancy, we will need to test for HLA antibodies because these folks they're going to be receiving the units, most likely on ventilators, and we don't want to put them at risk for additional transfusion-related acute lung injury that could cause their condition to deteriorate. The donors will need to meet all allogeneic blood donor eligibility criteria on the day of donation. The current guidelines by the FDA say that the donors may donate plasma once every 28 days. The OneBlood medical directors can make exceptions on frequency on a case-by-case basis. So, again, that'll be something we'll be looking at as we go forward. If we have issues with the donor pool, that is something that we could be looking at if we need to get more donors in or more donations available. There will be a pre-screening health history questionnaire, and this will be completed by 3 individuals. It'll be completed by the patients. The healthcare provider will have to complete a section that you see on the screen, and it's also been should be available as part of the materials for this lecture today. And then OneBlood personnel will finish the screening of the donor, and that will be signed off by a blood bank medical director. And there's a paper form, and the physician needs to put an attestation that's listed on the screen as well for the testing. The products that may be collected, if we collect it by apheresis, we hope to get 1 to up to even 3 units of plasma that's collected. And just a point of clarification, because I've gotten some questions from this on docs. The emergency IND needs to be for each individual patient that's going to be receiving the product. The blood collection can be from one donor, and multiple products can be collected, and that can go to multiple patients. So what the FDA has told us is this is a standard blood product, just like the plasma that you would normally keep in the hospital. The difference is that this is from individuals that have recovered from COVID. So from our end, if an individual, for example, collects a plasma on apheresis and 3 components are being able to be made, then that can go to the hospital and potentially go to 3 different patients. But each of the patients will need their own EIND. And if it's collected from whole blood, then we'll only get 1 unit. And as Dr. Reich alluded to, our very first Florida donor was the mayor of Miami. Donor letter. So we do have a donor letter that's part of our toolkit. And if you have a donor that is interested, you can give them a copy of the letter, again, included with the packet. It tells them where to call. One of the nice things, and like I said, we're going to try to be getting it up for the physicians, but we have it now for the donors, at least online, is they can actually go right to our website. They can say they want to donate convalescent plasma, and then they answer a series of questions here. Are they willing to donate? Do they want to have information shared? They fill out their information. Are they symptomatic? Has it been at least 14 days? Date of the last symptom. There's a nice calendar here. And have you had the follow-up test? And, then they answer this and they submit it. And the donors, if you have an individual that's interested in donating for one of your patients, they can certainly mention that when they're talking to our OneBlood personnel, that they're interested in doing a directed donation to someone from the someone at a particular hospital. So we're hoping to get, as Dr. Reich alluded to, we're hoping to get doctors from you, donors from your patients, and also donors from the community. Let me go on. So last section, frequently asked questions. So what is CCP? Well, it provides a passive immunity to antibody therapy. And there is a track record of it using it basically back to the Spanish influenza outbreak. And, Dr. Bush spoke about this as well. Before we had antibiotics, this was much more, these plasma and the immune globulins were much more used than antivirals and antibiotics today. And it was used during outbreaks of other respiratory illness pandemics. And you can see some nice pictures from the Spanish flu on the right side. I've got the reference down there if anyone wants to look at old pictures. Will it help the treatment of COVID patients? It appears that way. Further investigation is still necessary. And, eventually we hope to be able to get the pharmaceutical companies to produce an immune globulin. But that's still several months away. And, this is a nice bridge that can be done now at this point by both OneBlood and other blood centers throughout the U.S. What does the antibody titer require? So, a few comments on that. The FDA, the antibody testing is not ready to be done on these products in real time. So we're going to collect the product, we'll do the infectious disease testing, and send it off to your patient. A sample at this point will go to the National Institutes of Health for testing, but that will not be available until after the transfusion. We're looking at possibly setting up testing at OneBlood, and you can see the recommended titer is what you see on the screen, greater than 1 and 180, 1 to 80. And that concludes the presentation. Be happy to open up any questions. I think we have a question already, if I'm looking on the screen.
Dr. Vernon has a question. Stephen Vernon.
Yes.
So my question, Rich, is in order to expedite things, since you know who your donor is going to be, why don't you draw the donor's infectious disease testing 1 day or 2 days before the plasma is collected? It's a little out of ordinary, but it seems like you could do that. Sure, and I'll make an attempt to answer that. And we've got Dr. Reich here, who's basically the project lead. I mean, it's more of a logistic issue at this point. I think as we wrap up, certainly that does make sense. But we've got then the individual has to make 2 separate trips. And the way we're collecting these right now is these individuals are not going into branches. We're bringing them out to different mobiles, sites. We're bringing a mobile to them, and then they're going to be able to be collected there. So we're trying to minimize exposure to our staff. I'll stop there and turn it over to Dr. Reich and see if you want to add some additional comments. I don't want to misspeak on this.
The FDA generally wants the physical exam and testing done on the day of donation. Not to say that, the medical director might be able to wiggle around that a little bit, but I think in general, for the massive amount of donors we're anticipating, making a blanket exception probably would not necessarily be something that the medical director would feel comfortable doing. We would have to get FDA approval to do it at any kind of volume that I am anticipating we'll have. I guess as long as I have the microphone, there are a couple comments I'd like to make too that I failed to in the beginning. 28 days has been shown in the Chinese studies to be the day when they have the highest titer. So even though it may be tempting to take somebody 3 months out, et cetera, ideally you're really walking a very fine line there where you don't want to have them shedding virus, but you also still want a nice high antibody titer. So 28 days has really been shown in the somewhat limited studies we have to be the optimum time. And the other thing I want to point out, because it came up as a point of confusion already, is that although we think of type O as being a universal donor, it is not the universal donor on the plasma side. So you can give type O to people on the red cell side as a universal donor, but the universal plasma donor is actually type AB. So when you're looking at your donors and your patient match and you think you have a donor, just, please keep that in mind, that if, you have an AB patient, you're going to have to get only an AB plasma, basically, to be sure that you have compatibility.
Dr. Cosgrove has a question.
What is the average time of the first infusion of the plasma to most patients?
Well, I can speak to our experience at OneBlood only, and it's an experience of 1 unit so far. It took us 4 days of a full-time team manually to get that whole front end together and get it infused into the patient. As that included waiting for infectious disease testing. That happened to be a frequent blood donor, so we had a high, expectation that they would pass their infectious disease test. But that is something to bear in mind, is that even at best right now, it's not like calling for a unit of blood from the blood center. We pull it off the shelf and put it in a box and send it to you. We have to round up a donor and put them through, a multi-step process to qualify them before we can even collect. We do have mobile buses that we've dedicated to this, and we are willing to go just about anywhere to collect a donor. So once we have a donor cleared, the only thing that stops us is the infectious disease testing. We have to draw it and then wait for it for the next day. And then, we still have the hopefully remote possibility by that time that they might not pass their infectious disease test. But it is not.
I have a quick question. How do we get the word out that this program is available?
Well, I think we have sent to you, the Florida Medical Association, what we're calling our toolkit. And I don't know how you can distribute that widely, whether it's via email might be the best way to your membership. But, that would probably be the best way to get the word out to the community at large, that although not widely available yet, we're certainly ramping up and trying to get started. And we would love to have, donors that are not directed, so that we could actually get a frozen inventory on the shelf to pull out, quickly if we needed to.
Do you have a plan to market this directly to the public to get donors? Non-direct donors?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we have actually gone, thanks to, Mayor Suarez, we've been on national television. We've been on local television. We have it on our website. We have it on our social media page. We've done everything we can to bang the drum to get, the public interested in donating. And they can go right to our website at oneblood.org and actually log themselves in, answer all the questions, and kind of do their own pre-screen to see if they're eligible. I guess I should also mention that you may have seen or heard there was a press release and a press conference that touched on it. The federal government has put together a clearinghouse, a national clearinghouse for donors to on a website where they can log in anywhere in the United States, screen themselves and put in their zip code, and then the clearinghouse will then send them to the nearest blood center where they are located. So we expect to get quite a few people that way once it becomes widely known and is fully running.
Dr. Riggs has a question.
Well, thanks. What do we do up here in North Florida? Is Life South participating? And secondly, are the EIND reporting requirements to FDA and IRB suspended for this, or are they still in play like for all the other EINDs?
My understanding of, I'll answer your last question first. My understanding of the EIND is that the samples we send to NIH from the donors that we draw are approved under a national IRB for them to use for studies, going beyond just doing the antibody titers. And they also can use them for a biorepository. The EIND is not under IRB, although at OneBlood, we have decided to go ahead and put the EIND portion of it under our IRBs for approval, so that indeed, if other studies wanted to be done, locally, we could get samples and have a biorepository and basically report out our findings. So at this point, Rich can probably touch on that because he heads up our research department, and I believe he has put the paperwork in for the IRB approval for the EIND aspect of it at OneBlood, and then there is like some national studies headed up by Johns Hopkins and others that are closed as far as I know, except to certain institutions, and that's another route, for doing studies. So stay tuned. I think that the local blood centers will probably start doing their own studies and reporting their own experiences in their communities, which would be a wonderful thing to see. I don't know where Live South is exactly with this right now. I'm sure they're ramping up like everybody else, though.
Dr. Petit has a question.
There was recently a report out of California about IgG being isolated against this COVID-19 virus. And they got this off to the Army to replicate it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, as Rich mentioned, we talk almost daily to the head of CBER, and I can tell you that they're very excited and pushing very hard to get a pharmaceutical, concentrated IgG product out to this population. On the other hand, I must say that hearing the anecdotes, I am a little bit more of a wild card, I guess. I wonder if there might be something more than just the antibodies at play to get such fast results in such, very sick patients. And maybe there's a secret sauce in there we might lose if we purify it too much. But, we will know very soon, I think, because that antibody development is on a fast track. And we will soon see how effective it is.
Dr. Vasquez?
Yeah, my question is pertaining community hospitals. I work in a small community hospital, and my question is pertaining whether the blood bank personnel in the community hospitals are sufficiently educated and prepared to dispense this type of product. Are there any regulatory requirements for the hospital laboratory to comply with, and if their administration of the product differs in some way to what is employed in routine plasma product administration?
Yeah, because I've been dealing with this with several of the hospitals in the last week or so. So there's two ends of it that need to come into place. If you're going to have this in your hospital, there has to be a way, one, for your blood bank to receive it. So they've got to have certain codes to receive it. And your technologists, if they have questions about that, they can reach out to myself. We'll get you set up with the correct doctor in the region to handle it. The second item is your physicians need a way to order it. So if they order electronically, that'll need to be built into your IT system. If they order on paper, you'll have to have some way that the physicians can order it. But those are really the main two items that come into play. Your hospital can make decisions on, who gets it, dosing, but that's all more tailored to the individual hospital. It is an investigational product, so it's really up to the individual that's ordering it, what kind of dosing they want to give. But those two logistics, blood bank codes to receive it, and then the codes, how to order it in the hospital. If you get those together, you'll be all set.
Thank you.
Dr. Lynchus has a question.
So my question was, first, thank you very much for the presentation. I'd love to be able to get the copy of the slides that you presented. But with respect to the fact that COVID-19 is a reportable event to the Department of Health, has there been any thought to working with the department and trying to identify those patients that have recovered and then go after them in a more targeted fashion And the second part of my question was, I noticed on the slide with the 5 patients that were treated in China, all those 5 were given Kaletra, which we're not doing here in the States. It'd be interesting to see what the use of hydroxychloroquine and azithro is in patients that got convalescent plasma. And I wonder if we have any results from the state of New York, if they're doing this yet.
So I can answer the first question about the Florida Department of Health. They actually were the first place we went to try to get a donor database to see if we could identify people who are COVID positive. And, to their credit, they actually were very sensitive about protecting the patient's privacy. And so it was actually their suggestion that we work through the Florida Medical Association to contact the patients and identify them. And Rich, I don't know if you want to tackle the second question.
I'm not, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with, what New York State is doing at this point in time. Again, Dr. Wright mentioned we do have daily communication with the FDA and with the national blood organizations, but I don't have an answer for the second part. I will say, though, about the slides and the materials that we presented, we did give all those materials. I gave all those materials to the Food and Drug Administration, too many acronyms, to the Florida Medical Associations. I would ask that Dr. Giffler, Matt, and Melissa feel free to share the PowerPoint slides and the 3 types of letters that I emailed to you last night. We certainly want to make sure everyone has copies of those.
And that will be available on our website.